All right. Mark Twain rightly said that diplomacy was a sort of, game of give and take. Give one, take 10. There are ambassadors who do it with glide and do it with flair. They glide rather than prod. They engage rather than teach, and they present rather than pontificate. We're absolutely delighted to have with us today someone who is akin to a behind-the-scenes diplomatic superstar, if I may use the phrase, with a wealth of experience, having served in the United States of America, the former Soviet Union, then independent Russia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Mexico, apart from appointments at the Atomic Energy Commission. He was also awarded the third highest civilian honor of the country, the Padma Bhushan, in 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, please, you know, accompany me in welcoming Ambassador Ronen Sen. Sir, great to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Parth. A very good evening to you, and I'm very happy to join this conclave this evening. I think what I do is I'll just give you one. For instance, you talked about diplomacy. I'll give you just a very, very, I'll touch a number of bases.
Sure.
What does it mean? I mean, what are the primary priorities of our foreign policy? Number one, obviously, is preserving the unity and territorial integrity of India. That's number one, and all that it involves. So this involves, very, very close interaction, obviously, with the Ministry of Defense, our armed forces. All of us have very, very close interaction. For instance, when I was in Moscow, you had many more armed forces officers than foreign service officers. So, actually, that follows. And with everything, intelligence, again, is key, both external intelligence, internal intelligence, and of course, military intelligence. So that is a key input. Then you have, of course, the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is naturally there in terms of, you talk about unity and integrity, because there are internal aspects also, in terms of there might be internal uprisings or threats, whatever, which has nothing to do with external. One that has an external dimension, but a lot of it is internal security. Then you have another aspect, which is that of our states, because we are a federal polity, and states have most states. In fact, very, very few. There's maybe a 5, 6. You can count on your one finger. The states which do not have either land or maritime
border. Yeah, absolutely.
So it has a very direct,
few.
Very, very direct. So then, therefore, you have to interact very closely with that. So that has been set up. There's a separate division now for that, states division. Then you have branch secretariats in important metropolitan areas. So, all of that is there. And then, of course, another dimension of that is very important dimension, and it's linked. All these are interlinked, is promoting economic development. It's vitally critical. You can call it but whatever you want, but it's been there right from the beginning. Call it economic diplomacy, call it whatever you want. And it has a number of dimensions also. It can be bilateral, which is actually sometimes the most critical, or it can be multilateral, like, for instance, WTO, then mega-regional trade agreements, like RCEP.
Yeah, maybe something, exactly.
TTP, CPTTP, etc. SARC also, then FIMSTEC. So those, but bilateral,
FIMSTEC,
free trade agreements or the preferential trade agreements. You have the, various other means of working out the bilateral aspect. Then you have investments, which is a key part of it. Very key part. What I'm saying is where we play a direct role in terms of foreign policy. The bilateral investment treaties and arbitration, then internally contract enforcement, taxation, all these you're dealing with very, very directly. A very important element, and that's been there throughout, is in terms of technologies. And that is very, very fast moving, and it has a very direct impact on everything. It has an impact on immigration. It has an impact.
Probably why we are now seeing a lot of technology transfer pacts also between states.
between states. And also, the standards are, earlier it was just a very simple thing. I mean, is it a stable destination? You go there, invest. But now, there are a lot of things because of governments, their own interests. Again, very critical issues and sensitive issues like labor, movement of capital, movement of, like, for instance, technology transfers, but also environment comes in. That's a big consideration, particularly for youth, but otherwise also. It's a very important element. For instance, when you talk of climate change, it has huge economic implications, social
Absolutely.
implications. So all these, so you have, the new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, IoT, 3D printing can have a major impact on, supply chains, localization. So all of that, biotech, 5G now, communications.
5G,
Choices are not just technological, choices are geopolitical and other things also.
Right.
And there's the cost.
It's all interlinked.
It is all completely, all these things which I'm saying is interlinked. So if you take it, there also you have multiple divisions in the MEA itself, you know that. I mean, e-governance and IT, cyber, and, diplomacy, new and emerging technologies, which we just discussed, development partnership cooperation with a number of other countries. You have a number of them. Economic diplomacy, and of course, multilateral diplomacy. But you have all of that, and that is, you have to be on the ball because it affects you very, very directly. Then the third element, which is also integrated, is what is our biggest asset? And what is the biggest differentiator? Why India?
Right.
People said, why a single case exemption for India in the nuclear deal? Why India? For why single country? Why don't you make criteria? The biggest differentiator was the democracy. Not just a democracy, but a democracy which is a pluralist democracy. And as I mentioned earlier, federal democracy.
That is sort of exactly what I was coming to.
It's a vitally important
sort of since time immemorial, sort of nation states have projected their own ideals and principles, be it Athenian democracy, Spartan warfare, or American free will and Soviet collectivism. So what does India bring to the table in an increasingly multipolar world? What sets India apart exactly?
This is another thing which set India apart. This was a defining, as I was saying, defining characteristic of that. So this is something which you can't say that, look, this is separate. This is internal, because there's nothing internal anymore. Internal and external, as I was saying, with all these, they are vitally important internally, development, but they have external dimensions. We cannot ignore it. What we have to do is we have to address it to our satisfaction. We need not let the others determine what it should be, but this is a factor whether we like it or not. So these are all these factors. And taking into account these factors, it developed. For instance, a lot of people, when we were independent, the first thing when you became independent is naturally, you fought very hard for it. You want to preserve it. So what do you do? Extrapolate that into foreign policy, preserving our independence of judgment and action.
That is the first priority. Absolutely.
Which is non-linear.
India will determine its own course.
Right. You take your size, you take your civilization heritage, you take all of that together. Even in terms of economy, even if we bungle it badly, ultimately, hopefully, we will be the third largest economy, isn't it? So, inevitable. So, so all that comes into play. And freedom struggle.
Live chat.
Yeah. So, non-alignment, I emphasize without the hyphen. Because the entire thing is a concept. It is not non-aligned in the sense of I'm equidistant. I will judge issues, on my own, in the light, naturally, of my interests and my principles. And it's always a balance of principles and practice, ideals and interests. So those are balanced.
Right.
And that, as the world changed, it became, now it's becoming multipolar, etc. So our concepts, develop from non-alignment to non-alignment 1, non-alignment 2, strategic economy, and whatever you have. But it is how to best serve your interests and your ideals, both, and
and
reconcile.
probably be and probably rise as a respected power. I mean, you don't want to rise as a power that others look down upon or feel intimidated by. You want to rise as a power that is respected by people who want you at the high table.
Right. Yeah. And also the concept of high table also, because we have to look at it in terms of what we contribute in real terms, because that makes sense also. Because if you take an issue like what are the issues which are really existential? That is, which is to survive. For all of this, territorial integrity, you have to survive as a humanity, isn't it?
Right.
So the threats,
Absolutely.
nuclear weapons threats,
Climate
biological.
change, nuclear weapons.
Now you have pandemic, which is, you might say, in the field of medicine. Sure. That is, it's a threat. Climate change is surely a threat, because the other ones you can control. But climate change, unless you do it right now, it is surely going to lead you to extinction. So all these, and all of them have severe social, as I was saying, economic and other dimensions, including that of sovereignty.
Right. Extending our talk of the high table, throughout history, there have been organizations of nations. There's the Treaty of Westphalia, there's the Concert of Europe, then we had the League of Nations, and now the United Nations. For a rising India that has been knocking on the doors of the Security Council for decades now without making much headway, and we're unlikely to make much of a headway anyway. Is it imperative upon us to develop as an economic superpower, and so that the Security Council is incomplete without India at the table? Is that what it will take for us to get there in that sense?
I agree with you entirely. You couldn't have said it in a better way. And let me tell you, for instance, I agree with you, and I've said this for years, not as a matter of, in a negative manner. I said it's not going to happen. I don't see this immediately happening. That means you're getting admitted into let's say, the permanent 5, expanding into P6 or P7 or P8 with the inclusion of India. Logically, it should happen because we have a better claim than many of the present members. That's a fact. On whatever.
we are amongst
forget about geography, forget about longitude, latitude. If you're talking of representing humanity, you're a big chunk of humanity. You take any criteria at all, you fit the bill. Otherwise people talking of north, south, all that.
Right.
But the basic thing is, I personally feel that it's very unedifying and undignified, and it doesn't behove our status to be constantly banging on the table. What we should not do right now, people are actually reconciled to the fact that they should get in as a second-class permanent member. That is without
non-permanent member. Yeah,
it's not. I mean, what is it there for? I mean, because basically what you said, I fully agree with you. The UN, and you've seen that the role of the Security Council, hardly anything goes to the Security Council. Decisions are taken outside. So you make them more and more, because basic issue is it doesn't reflect the realities, current realities today. It reflected the realities perhaps, that's also a question mark, at a time when it was set up.
Right.
But that also is a question mark. But right now it certainly doesn't. So how will it have the role, anybody's role, a country's role, an organization's role? It's regarded, it's in terms of context, in terms of its current relevance.
Absolutely.
So you have to change that. And I agree with you above all, because it's a country's, what is now called, comprehensive national power. It includes all of this. It includes cultural dimension. It includes a lot of things, what you call soft power. It includes, of course, military power is important, but above all today, it's economic. Right. And that is where we have really to get our act together and embark on it, because we have lost a lot of time. We have to get back on track. And I would say that, for instance, if you ask me, which is the single most important national security priority for India, I would say economic growth. Rapid economic growth, but socially inclusive, because it has to be sustainable.
Absolutely. Sustainable is the correct word there.
Is the key. Whether sustainable from the point of view environment, but sustainable in terms of having a lot of stakeholders, not for a minuscule few. That's important.
It has to be the entire country that sort of becomes and grows as an economy.
Right. And
starting from the village right up to the city.
Absolutely. I agree with you. That is
so sort of in this changing context, then, if the UN is sort of remains rigid as it is, and as it will likely remain so, does the sort of nations that form separate groupings, be it the Quad, be it the BIMSTEC, that are now being formed, small groupings that are formed to serve a purpose. They may not be sort of a big world organization, but they serve a purpose. Is that where we are heading now? A concurrence, but not a congruence.
Right. You're right also. And this process began some time back. I'll give you an example. Let's say even we realized that even 1983, when when you had a meeting which took place of an online conference, heads of government in Delhi. The biggest issue was Iran-Iraq. And the biggest decision was, where do you meet next? Not what you do as an organization, isn't it? So then, same thing when we went to the Belgrade conference, that was in the late 80s. And I was there. And it was quite frustrating because everyone was making statements, all the leaders, meant not for consumption. They were not listening to each other, but it was for their respective home constituencies. So ultimately what happened is a lot of other issues, and the online movement became, earlier it played a tremendous role in terms of, colonialism, getting rid of colonialism, more countries becoming independent, then also, removal of apartheid. So the Commonwealth played a bigger role. But, all those were very good initiatives. But at the end of it, where do you go next? For instance, you raised the issue of the economy. What role were we playing? The G7 had been established. The G7 had no interlocutor. So as a result of that, in the Belgrade conference, we have thought of setting up, let's say, 7 or 8 countries, non-aligned, large. But the problem was that without China, it would not have been relevant. So they were not non-aligned. And also, what happened was that the group got enlarged and it became the G15. Of course, we had number of meetings. But it was too diffuse and it was not a credible enough interlocutor. Today, the answer is, and that was also set up when I was in Washington after that American financial crisis, and that is the G20. So that is relevant today, G20. That is something at least where it's large, but it's compact enough to have some decision making, beyond the OECD. So those are the kind of things. As you mentioned, SARC should have been there, as a group, but it never took off. Because when we are talking, because when you're talking of any great power aspiration or any country also, irrespective of whether you have any great power aspiration, a peaceful neighborhood and a cooperative neighborhood helps everybody, including that country. So if you have a prosperous neighborhood, it's better for the country.
Sort of coming to a neighborhood, coming to the neighborhood, just as relative, we have a choice with relatives, we don't have a choice with our neighbors. So in the last few years, in pursuing and establishing deeper ties with nations in North America and Europe, have we sort of started ignoring our neighborhood a bit? I'm talking about this in reference to recent happenings in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota port and cancelling of contracts. Is there something we need to do we need to be much more proactive there?
Oh, very much so. We have to be there. But, as I was saying, the world, and you pointed out right in the beginning, your first question was multipolarity, multiple sources of power and of influence. And, and all of these abhor a vacuum. But, vacuum does not exist, because communications are faster. The world is changing. The world is changing in every which way you can imagine. So that itself was there. Even if you look at the 80s, or even if you look at before that, you had problems. In fact, let's say, for instance, in our neighborhood, and in the context of China and the United States and the former Soviet Union, we had this problem in Sri Lanka, for instance. And that was supposed to be a failed accord, 1987. Actually, it was not, because that is the only thing which we are still wanting the Sri Lankans to do. That is the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution. 13th Amendment was as a result of the Indo-Sri Lankan Agreement. And that, if that was honored, or if it is honored, even at whatever, you will always have a problem unless that is honored. Because that is fundamentally vitally important for Sri Lanka's own security and stability and economic progress, which is critical to ours because the problems there flow into our country. Similarly, if you look at Nepal.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the immediate neighborhood.
There again, we had these problems even at that time in the 80s. Chinese arms supplies, various things which are going on, and other activities, ISI activities. So we didn't act in a vacuum, just when you say you put the blockade, it was not, because it doesn't serve our interests. But we have to take people together. Similarly with Bangladesh, the liberation, you had mass movement of people. It disrupted. The population of Tripura, population of refugees was much greater than the local population. So it had a huge impact, not just economic, sociological, political, massive impact. So all of that, you're right, we have to find ways, and we can do that. SARC, let's say, didn't work out because of one country, but even now, BIMSTEC, you can do much more. Rather than only declaration, you should put that into effect with greater communication.
Just coming in, sort of, just a quick heads up to the audience. We are taking questions. You can put your questions in the YouTube chat, and you can ask them out on Instagram. As soon as we get questions, we'll try and put them across to Sir, and hopefully we can get a great answer. When we talk about trust deficits or enforcing contracts or agreements, and how that results in a little bit of bad blood, I sort of wanted to relate it out to appointments to the External Affairs Ministry, or maybe the Minister of External Affairs themselves. There are a number of political appointees, and then there's people like, say, the current Minister of External Affairs, S. Jaishankar, who sort of gone up through the ladder and is now serving as a minister. Is it beneficial from a policy continuity point of view to have somebody from the establishment, or does it not really matter much whoever is the face?
It does matter. It does matter, and I think that he is a very good choice for the job, because he brings, he's been a professional a diplomat, with wide experience, and I can say this, I can vouch for this, because he was there on his first posting to Moscow when he had come for training. We were colleagues at that time. I was in Moscow also, and subsequently, I mean, for the nuclear deal, the NSSP, which was with Atal Bihari Vajpayee and George Bush. A lot of that, he's played a very direct role, and quite apart from that, he was in Sri Lanka. He knows the neighborhood pretty well, Japan. So he's a good choice. He's not the first. We've had previously foreign service officers who were external affairs ministers. You had K.R. Narayanan, who was there, Minister of State. You had Natwar Singh, who was a cabinet minister and a Minister of State in external affairs. And you have had foreign service officers in every post. You had President of India, Vice President of India, Speaker, and many other cabinet ministers. So it is not necessarily, being foreign service officer is not necessarily a disqualification for the jobs, because you learn the same thing, dialogue. You don't have shouting matches. A good diplomat is a persuader. It's not necessarily a good speaker. You don't have to be. Because the last thing you should do is to win a debate.
Right.
If you win a debate, you lose argument.
Right. You're basically there to make friends, is what I'm getting from what your answer.
I'm not saying friends. Just get the person to agree to it. And the best way is if that person thinks that it's his own idea. That's the best. But
that's a life lesson in itself. Okay, there's a quick audience question that I'll just put across. So you touched a little bit of nuclear throughout our conversation. So there's an audience question here that says, could Sir list out a few major milestones in India's nuclear journey?
our nuclear journey. Oh, that's a long journey.
Yeah.
It was there much before I joined the Atomic Energy Commission. But basically, let me tell you that we had, our nuclear weapon program is not a new thing. It was started off before our independence. A fabulous person, Homi Bhabha. He should be a household name, actually. Unfortunately, he died in an aircraft crash. But the legacy was continued. And that is basically to establish nuclear power in India, both for civilian purposes, but also noting what is happening in the world around. You can't be oblivious to that. But to set up capabilities in India for a nuclear explosive device and also eventually weaponization. While working for global disarmament, simultaneously prepare for a world which may not achieve those results. As you know, and it was unfortunately true that the Non-Proliferation Treaty did not work, precisely because like you mentioned about the United Nations Security Council, it just permanently made some people haves and some people have nots. And the only way you can have effective non-proliferation is to not allow people to modernize or industrialize. So simultaneous to develop both. So my involvement was, at the time of first involvement was in the 70s, at a time which was a critical moment also, because you had the first nuclear explosion. We called it an implosion. The peaceful PNE, we call it PNE. But be that as it may, it set off a massive reaction. Not only a massive reaction, not only the United States reacting negatively, but everyone. I mean, whether it's Soviet Union, virtually all the countries, everywhere. But the most vociferous was the countries like Canada, the United States, Japan, because of its history. But ultimately, so then you had the visit, for instance, of Carter. One of my most difficult jobs was to prepare a very brief note for Prime Minister Morarji Desai, because he would not read anything more than 2 or 3 pages. And Jimmy Carter, was a specialist. He was a lieutenant under Admiral Rickover, who was a father of nuclear energy. Admiral Rickover. He knew things backwards. And then the reactions to that, a nuclear law was passed, a committee was set up called the Zanga Committee, what items should or should not be transferred to India, which went much beyond nuclear power. It was affecting the industrialization of what we're talking about, technologies being stopped. So all that was taking place. So we went through that phase. Then we went through another phase where we gradually sort of, established a program of our own. But when we finally broke through, that was later stage, when that was the nuclear agreement, civil nuclear agreement.
Open, probably.
With the United States.
Yeah, of course.
And that in turn opened up, it was a key which opened up for the world through the NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, and so on and so on. So that went round full cycle. And at the same time, it removed a very major bilateral irritant in the relationship, But the first beneficiaries were not the United States. First beneficiary was Russia. Second was France, etc., and the others. So that is something which is still in the works. It's moving at a very glacial pace. And hopefully, I think we take our time, but hopefully we'll get our act together. Even I'll tell you when you say we take our time, with Kudankulam, we have a nuclear power plant which is set up there.
Yeah, Russian, yeah.
That was signed with Gorbachev. I was there at that time, worked out that agreement also. We knew that, things are going to be difficult. So we included a clause that you cannot have retroactive application of laws, domestic laws, retroactively. So that, because when Russia later on signed the other agreements following the NSG, then it could not export it. So this agreement helped in preventing that from happening. So, but anyway, that was a long story, long and short of it. It was very,
so that there's a sort of a very quirky audience question that's come in. Probably that's in response to President Carter and Gorbachev. So somebody from the audience wants to know, in Ambassador Sen's experience, which world leader did he interact with who had the sort of the most aura, who owned the room when he walked in, who was the most diminutive? So people want to know that.
Very frankly, first thing, if you're a diplomat, never get overawed. Don't let any light behind you. No, I had the privilege of meeting large number of people from all over. Carter certainly not. I mean, to forget about it. And I think he was given the right answer by Morarji Desai, because Morarji Desai was known for his strong anti-communist credentials. Carter was very happy with that because once he told him also during that visit that it's good that Morarji Desai said it's a bad thing when people build walls, to prevent movement. Carter beamed and he said, "Yeah, you're right. These communists, they do that, and we have to break down those walls." So Morarji Desai says they build walls to keep people in. You build walls to keep people out. So number of people. First meeting with Nelson Mandela. He makes a huge impression. Getting him over to India, a large number of people. We had the good fortune of meeting a lot of them, as also dictators and others. I won't single out anyone, really. There were many inspirational figures and others also, because we are very directly involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. We met virtually all the people there, from Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, number of others. And they were inspirational figures at that time. But
right.
I won't single out anyone.
That's the answer of a diplomat.
Not really. I'm being honest.
So coming to talking about walls, I recently sort of picked up S. Jayashankar's book that has come out, The India Way. In it, the minister says, and I quote, "It is important for India to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, and reassure Russia." So talking of America, was the American decline expected, or did President Trump's tenure sort of accelerate it? Because America is a waning power probably now.
It is true. You're right. It's all about relative power, isn't it? It's still the number one power in every way possible in terms of in terms of technology we discussed, which is a defining innovation, which is the real strength of America is innovation. Number two is not only innovation, but to industrialize, that is commercialize the use of technologies. UK is, for instance, is very, per capita, UK is much better than the United States also in terms of, fundamental research and all that. But in terms of implementing that and putting that to use and then to innovate further on a continuous basis, there's no country like the United States. So therefore, you have people from all over the world coming in. whether it's from Germany, whether it's from anywhere, from Nordic countries, from anywhere, you have them migrating. Why? Because they have this whole ecosystem of innovation. That's the biggest strength. So, but nevertheless, in relative terms, it's declining. And in relative terms, the one which is rising the fastest, which rose the fastest, rising the fastest, is China.
China, absolutely. Talking of rising powers and waning powers, how important are the personal equations between leaders? We've had sort of recently it's come up in the news a lot. We've had Prime Minister Modi who had personal relations with President Trump, with President Obama. So how important are these personal relations when there's sort of significant upturns in relative status of power?
Personal relations always remain important. In fact, I've been in over the years, over the decades, over 180 summit meetings with, as I was telling you, with different people, wide, varied people.
Yeah.
Okay. And as I mentioned some names, but there are a number of others. But let me tell you, personal equations, they cannot be dismissed or say that this is a personal, ego trip. It's not that.
Just a personal equation. Yeah.
It is not that, because it does make a difference. Because ultimately, who are the decision makers? So if you are able to establish your credibility with them, it makes an impact. I've seen this, working out extremely well. Sometimes if you don't get on, it makes an impact also. Like the dislike between Indira
probably
Gandhi.
Something that happened with exactly. I was coming to that. Indira Gandhi and President Nixon.
And Nixon, yeah. So it was mutual, fully reciprocated on both sides. So, but and it happens also. I mean, it happens. I mean, they are individuals. But I'm telling you, in a very serious way, one of the most important things which you do when you prepare briefs, at least at that level, because you're not doing it at the minister's level, when you're preparing briefs at that level. And I was for 6 years with 4 prime ministers. I was their foreign and defense policy advisor. So ultimately, you have no one else to turn to, because you are preparing the brief, and that is the input.
The buck stops with you.
Buck stops with prime minister, not really. But ultimately, if you are giving that input, one of the most critical inputs is not a 2-dimensional, this person did this and did that and all. What is that person like? A 3D, maybe better still, it could be 4D person. How will that person, same people in the same post, different people in the same post don't react in the similar manner. So you have to know that. It's very critical. You have to get a measure of that person. If you make a mistake there, you can have major mistakes later on, irrespective of whatever that person may show. You have to have a reading. That is a very critical thing. So it does make a difference, to cut it short. But what we try to do otherwise, generally, is to stay out of the internal politics of any country. Because it's best to get a broad-based support. In the case of the United States, bipartisan support. Not only bipartisan, but popular support. And that is what...
Was this bipartisan support one of the reasons why a nuclear agreement with the United States came about?
It was the only reason.
How important was that?
It was the only reason. It was the only reason. You see, I was not, though I had witnessed, I was part of the first discussions right from the time it started, after the nuclear test of 74. I was one of a number of negotiators, not even the most active one. Because as I said, technology has changed. What I knew, like the back of my hands, at one time, I didn't know at that particular time, because I had not been in that business. So at that time also, I only knew whom to ask what question. That also takes a lot of expertise. But at that particular, it's very critical. Nowadays everything is in terms of acronyms and all that. But I'll tell you, how it worked out. The nuclear deal was in the 5 Ps. 5 Cs rather: Congress was critical because you were successful not only in getting the congressional Republican-controlled Congress, but a Democratic-controlled Congress and more than 80% support, close to 90%. It was you had to sweat blood for it. It didn't happen. You had to buttonhole individual. I personally met more than 248 congressmen, 59 senators in their constituencies, not a single weekend. If you meet them in the office, then you can't say the same thing to everyone. Because you say the same thing to anyone, you talk to anyone, it gets to the others. So you have to reach out to the person personally. What is that person's interest? Tailor the briefing accordingly. So what I'm saying, it's a humongous. So, and that in that purpose for the Congress, you have to reach out to different states. So visiting all the states in the United States, because that is where their constituencies are. What are the interests of those states? Work out some trade agreements also accordingly. For instance, Washington State, apples, selling mangoes. Apples, vitally important in those states. Mangoes, important for some parts of our country. Yeah. So those kind of things, and they are very important. Almonds for California. I'm telling you, they are very critically important. Those, as I was telling you right in the beginning, they are all interlinked.
It is a small things that matter in the end.
It matters. Then the second C is community. Community means you have the Indian Americans. The first time and the only time they have been organized on one cause. That's the nuclear deal. They were galvanized all across. You had different groups. You had, some belonged to the overseas friends of the BJP, some the Congress, a lot of the independent. They were young, old, first generation, third generation, fourth generation. All of them, all galvanized. But it was not only, when I say community, you had to reach out to the different religious denominations, the evangelical Christians, very important part, which like Mike Pence and the others are, Jeff Sessions, very critical element. You also had, different constituencies, apart from the religious groups, denominations, the Black Caucus, vitally important. Right. And they varied also in different places, the African Americans, the Latinos, which we call them, different groups, all of these groups together. So community meant all of that. We were just not talking about corporate. That was another C, vitally important, not just in general terms. It was not just about nuclear power. They were just General Electric and Westinghouse. No. It was many of the others, heavyweights, who had nothing to do with nuclear power. But why were they interested? They were interested because India was seen to be on the move. When you talked about, you had mentioned economic growth. India was growing at that time, the years when I was there, it was 5 years, growing at an average of 8.5%. In 2 or 3 of those years, it grew more than 9%. So all of that came, culture came in, big way. Culture came in, for instance, I hosted a number of events like the Washington National Opera, India Day, it was India focused. So, large number of communication, media, not just big media, one media statement. It's the easiest thing to do is to make a speech. You have to reach out to individuals, including in suburban papers. Multiple, because those people read the suburban local papers. Get them on board. So all of that, so you had these multiple things which coalesced into one net result. And that is what, when I say bipartisan, that will survive. Individuals might come and go, but that survives.
Right. Absolutely. There's a quick audience question. And since we're running out of time, I'll sort of run through the audience questions first before going back to the questionnaire.
Absolutely.
So the audience question is, what can we expect from the tenure of President Biden and Vice President Harris? That's probably a question that you've sort of heard a lot since the election.
No, but even before the elections, I had said, because Biden is someone who's known to us. Of course, he was personally known to me, but many of our friends and colleagues he was known to. Because at that time, when I talked about the Congress, he also played a key role, among others. That is, he was at one time the ranking member, that's number 2, when the nuclear deal was announced. And he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee when the Democrats were there. So he's known, and he's known as a person who reaches across the aisle. He's a person who believes in reconciliation, meeting midway, and he's very familiar with India. He has been, throughout his Senate career, we know him. We've had a number of conversations with him. We knows what makes him tick, and he's an institutional man also. He will not go on an individual tour. He will go on an institutional.
He's probably predictable from a policy point of view.
Predictable, and he's also institutional, because institution strength of any institutions is vitally important. Any institution, they are the pillars of any system, and that is what came under threat. So even now he's facing unprecedented challenges in a very, very divided polity.
America.
But he's the best person for that job among all the others. Others like Elizabeth Warren, anybody else, they would have been very divisive. So he represents, I would say, in one word, continuity, and he'd pick up on a number of elements, positive elements of the Trump legacy. Trump legacy is not all negative. Certainly not. There are a lot of things.
Especially for India, yes, definitely.
For India, certainly. Particularly if you take the defense security dimension, very rapid strides. During this time. During the time of Narendra Modi and Donald Trump, there were very rapid strides, particularly in the area, and resulting in the Quad, etc. And others.
Absolutely. So sort of that wraps up the America segment of our discussion, probably, unless a great audience question comes in. As I was sort of alluding to earlier, that there's been a lot of interest in your tenure in Russia and formerly the Soviet Union. So something that I wanted to ask, and something that has come up from the audience as well, is how epochal was that moment on the 25th of December, 1991, when the Soviet flag flew on the Kremlin for the last time? So sort of, where were you? What was your personal recollection?
Well, no, that was the time when I was asked by, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao to go to Moscow. I took a little bit time about, reaching there, unfortunately. But ultimately I did reach there. I took my time because my predecessor was very unwell at that time, and didn't want to be moved out. Very competent predecessor at that time, but it marked a huge change. It was not entirely unexpected for us, I'll tell you, but it was leading to that. Because the Soviet system was very ossified, it was very fragile, and so. It was definitely, it had it made a change, and we saw those changes even during the 6 years I was there as ambassador. Everything was changing. The society around us was changing. People whom I knew, I could not even visit them at their homes for various reasons, because they're so hospitable. Because I knew that people don't realize, you talk about big geopolitical issues, it's like the life savings becoming 6 months expenditure. How is that for an impact? Forget about your family being divided and different citizens in different countries needing visas.
Right.
But that is the harsh reality. So I knew that then they were very warm, hospitable, old friends. But I knew when I went there, it would be the equivalent of at least 2 weeks expenditure on that one meal. So I made some excuse.
Right.
So, but it was not very, it was very, very difficult. You had 2,000% inflation. You had, there was a lot of changes. Life expectancy declined during the period because of sense of hopelessness.
Right.
Birth rate fell. So it was a huge change, and the process. And I went through the most challenging part of that, when you really had a roller coaster ride, when
Right.
you didn't know what was going to happen next, but you had to get it right, because if you took wrong decisions at that time, it would have major implications on India.
So sort of coming in right there. Yeah. Just a quick sort of butting in. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sure.
So you spoke about making the right decisions. How difficult was it, and how did we decide what country to recognize once the Soviet Union sort of dissolved? How difficult was it to when and how do we recognize a country as independent or not in the Union when we already have relations with Moscow?
Well, no, that I don't think that was the most difficult part of it, very frankly. But we did that. We did that fairly quickly, and a lot of times we got it right. Sometimes we got it terribly wrong. But because we thought, for instance, that Lithuania and and Poland are both Roman Catholic countries in a Orthodox region, that is Christian Orthodox region.
Right.
We thought that the Lithuanian new state could be covered by our ambassador in Poland, which was a mistake because they never got along. So being of the same religion doesn't mean that you get along. In fact, there are a lot of problems. So same in Central Asia. You had Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. We should have known it because the Mughals came from one part of Tajiks
right.
from Uzbekistan, Fergana Valley. But mostly we got it right. The biggest challenge was basically in terms of defense and security. Biggest challenge because of India's dependence. At that time, it was close to 80%. So if that was disrupted, your entire system, the armed forces, the inventory, all that came into, and you would basically see this bottom of that being taken out, collapse. So that was a huge challenge. How do you restore the product support, the spare support, the life support, the whole thing, life extension of engines and so on and so forth. How do you ensure that? And how during that particular point of time, and this involved very sensitive areas, which you couldn't get for for love or money from anywhere in the world, which you still can't get. So some of those projects actually took off during that period. So that was a challenge, and that was very literally when you had no system, you had a Russian saying for that, walking in between raindrops. So, and that was judgment and quick actions. And it was tense, I can tell you. And that's where I had my first heart attack also. Tension.
That must have definitely been tough. Okay, so the audience now wants us to sort of swivel away from the Soviet Union and go over to the Middle East. They want to know why, in your opinion, did the Arab world choose to have better relations with India when an important member like Pakistan was against it?
I think that I don't think Pakistan was, of course, a factor, but generally the OIC, the Organization of Islamic States, but that has a long history. But it is basically, what we discussed when you asked the question right in the beginning of, in interest. It served the interest, because we are, in terms of whether it's our energy needs, longer term, the value added by this relationship. And so a lot of those gel in terms of the intersection of interest and overlapping interest. And this applied particularly to the UAE and, of course, the most important country in that area, which is Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah. And that I think is one of the major successes. That breakthrough is one of the major successes in recent years in terms of our policy. And at the same time, keeping Iran on board, which is
right.
Which is
probably the most powerful country in the Middle East right now. Maybe, I mean.
Effectively, yes, thanks to various steps taken by the United States and other countries also, I would say.
Right.
But at the same time, bringing a very important relationship which has come out in the open, which used to be behind the parda, which is our relations with Israel.
Israel,
it's a very small country, but it's a very important
significant.
country.
Yeah,
very significant. Again, in terms of
right.
defense and other strategic requirements.
Absolutely. So this will probably be the last question before we'll be forced to conclude for want of time. So what sort of I wanted to talk to you about, you sort of touched upon it with Iran. There's been a lot of talk about sanctions on Iran and North Korea, thanks to their nuclear programs and their explorations there. In your experience, do sanctions in the way they are applied currently will they have any sort of effect? Because I mean, for example, North Korea has their own Juche philosophy of self-reliance and self-independence, and Iran in itself, with its proxies, maybe the Hezbollah, finds ways to get things done anyway. So in your experience, are sanctions going to make an impact in installing the nuclear programs of those countries?
I don't think, very frankly, I don't think sanctions have served their intended purpose ever, anywhere. But sanctions, in some ways, and the degree and the extent to which they are applied, also is a reflection of domestic opinion in that particular country. You can't seem to sort of governments can't appear to throw up their hands and saying we are helpless.
Right.
So you are perforce, you have to take some actions, and it's a combination of various things. Sometimes there are attempts directly to topple the governments if they are fragile enough, or
that is a favorite pastime of a few countries.
We shouldn't rush to judgment. We shouldn't just. Sometimes we helped in creating a country, for instance.
Right.
But I think. What I'm saying is those who have the ability to do it, but generally I would say that it has never served the purpose for which it is intended. But sometimes they are inevitable, and how it is applied also is very important. If it's applied as a leverage with certain incentives, otherwise by themselves they don't work.
Right. All right. With that, we've probably come to the conclusion of our discussion about foreign policy and diplomacy with Ambassador Ronen Sen today. In conclusion, if I might say, in each period of Indian history, there's been black eras and white eras. We should not want to divide them up and just embrace the white eras while repudiating the black eras. It is our history. It is our future. Its victories are going to be our victories. Its losses are going to be our losses. In an increasingly multipolar world, it is probably time for India to stand up and be meaningfully counted. And that is probably the essence of what Ambassador Sen has said today. Develop as an economy and make sure your presence or your absence in particular is felt. A big thanks, first of all, to a wonderful audience who've been really picking up and putting across lots of quirky questions. A quick heads up as well, VishwaConclave 2021, the third edition, will be held in VIT Pune on the 17th of April. Watch out for the speaker lineup that comes up soon, and tickets will be live soon as well. I would now like to take this opportunity to thank Ambassador Sen, first of all, for sparing his time today and for his extremely insightful remarks. I mean, if we had time, we could have probably gone on for another hour or so. So we hope to have you back with us sometime soon. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, Pat.